Today, we have a very special guest back on the channel, Dr. J. Aaron Simmons, to talk about his journey from an avid fisherman to one of the leading scholars in Kierkegaard around the world. Dr. Aaron Simmons has most recently come out with a book called Camping with Kierkegaard, a great book that you should all check out. The link to that will be in the description below. To get this interview started, Aaron, what got you into philosophy?
Well, first, dude, thank you so much for having me back on. It's always a pleasure to chat with you, and the stuff that you're producing and offering to the world, I think, is really life-giving and powerful stuff. So again, it's an honor to be with you. So I got into philosophy sort of, in a weird way. I started as a physics major. I became a history major for my actual degree, went and did a graduate degree in intellectual history and humanities. And it wasn't until then, in my graduate degree, that I kind of moved into philosophy. And I think the seeds for it had been laid maybe a few years earlier. So as an undergrad, I went to a Christian college, amazing school, but they did not have a philosophy program. And so one of the theologians, an amazing professor, Pentecostal theology guy, but he taught an intro to philosophy course every once in a while. So I took the class. And in that class, I immediately was just hooked. I thought, wow, this stuff is amazing. I loved the kind of mental acrobatics that it required. I loved the rigor that we were bringing to the table. And I loved that the questions were really the point. So, of course, we wanted to find answers. Of course, we wanted to figure out where we stood and why it matters to stand here rather than there. But all of it was nested in life being devoted to asking really good questions, and these questions throwing us into this conversation with some of the most intelligent, most creative, most interesting thinkers in history. And so I went to the professor, said, "Oh my goodness, I love this. Why don't we offer a philosophy major?" And his response was, "Well, because the board of directors doesn't want to create atheists of the students." And that really stuck with me, right? I was like, my goodness, why is that the worry? And of course, it was partly tongue in cheek and, all these sorts of things. But it stuck with me because it made me really palpably understand that ideas have consequences. And thinking philosophically requires, this is how I would now say it, it requires that we interrogate what assumptions have traditionally been in play in our lives. And so when I went to grad school, that idea of interrogating the assumptions that I had long held to be true, and even making those assumptions visible so I could ask questions about them, that really became compelling to me. And so in graduate school, studying history, studying humanities, I increasingly leaned into philosophy because eventually it seemed to me that philosophy was where the rigor of the question and the seriousness with which we took those questions was the point. And that was just unbelievably compelling. And so, I started saying, wow, the questions that keep me up at night, I can spend my life asking and get paid to teach people about these questions and wrestle with Kierkegaard and existentialists and phenomenologists and, walk through life with Plato and Aristotle. Like, heck yeah, I'm in. And so that's really kind of how I moved into philosophy and stuck with it.
That's a really wonderful introduction to your journey into philosophy, and it does open a few of the pathways that we will be pursuing during this interview. Let's start off with your relationship between philosophy and your Christian faith. When I first got into philosophy, my mother was a bit concerned about the fact that me studying philosophy and theology at university may lead me away from the Christian faith. In the same way, have you experienced any situations where you as a Pentecostal Christian has come in conflict, or your Christianity has come in conflict with the philosophy that you're studying, and how those two relate to each other?
Yeah, so your audience might get this. A lot of audiences I talk to don't, but my mom is still alive and doing well. She now for over 2 decades has, quote, prayed for God's covering on my mind every single day because she's really worried about what it sounds like your mom is worried about, right? And I think this is appropriate. Our parents are concerned that we stay committed to what they tried to teach us was worth our commitment. And that makes tons of sense to me. In my own case, I think I'd approach it a little bit differently, which is I have no interest in staying committed to just what I've been taught. I have interest in increasingly living invested toward those commitments that continue to show up, as I say in the book, as worthy of my finitude. And so when I talk about my Christianity or my religious identity, it's not that philosophy, tempted me away from Christianity. It actually gave me the possibility of saying, hey, whatever you hold to be true and however you live and whatever actions you think are worth taking, are you doing them on purpose? Are you doing them in light of reflection? Or are you just kind of falling into it because that's what the crowd says is good, or that's what the they says is the right way forward? And it's important to understand when existentialists talk about things like the crowd mentality or the herd mentality, that applies every bit as much to the church, right? It's whatever community we find ourselves located within that then shuts down our ability to ask questions and interrogate what we then take for granted about how to live, what to believe, and what is the good. So I would say that it's not so much that philosophy challenged my Christian identity or Christian faith. It's that philosophy invited me to live on purpose in light of what I thought was worthy of the direction of my faith. And I understand faith and faithfulness, and this is the whole point of Camping with Kierkegaard, as risk with direction. And so if we are directing ourselves in life in a particular way, risk attends that way. And so I remain publicly identified as Christian. I still identify as a Pentecostal. Like, these are still part of how I make sense of my world and my life. But what that means, how it looks, which propositional, claims am I willing to assent to, all of that has shifted around because the way in which I relate to what it means to be a Christian on the other side of 25 years reading Bonhoeffer and Barth and Tillich and Heidegger and Simone de Beauvoir and Simone Weil and all, like, of course it's gonna shift, right? But I don't think it's gotten better, as if there was some, apex identity that we could somehow achieve and hold. I would say it's gotten more purposive. But at the same time, I would say that my Christian commitments are held not more tenuously, but I would say held a little bit more fallibly, held more humbly, hopefully. And I think that that's important because we can be humble and display true confidence. If we lack humility, our confidence will always be a idol of certainty masking real doubt, right? And so my thought is, you know what? I am on purpose Christian, not just, well, that's how I was raised. And my mom and I disagree about lots of aspects and ways that plays out. I'll give you just one example. I have moved much more in a universalist direction relative to soteriology, because the more I study, the more I read, the more I think, the more I live, the more I experience, exclusivism not only seems wrong, but it seems immoral and dangerous and out of character with who Christ is. I know lots of Christians will say that's ridiculous, that's heresy. Okay, like that's part of what I think is now produced by thinking philosophically, is not that it's going to move you in this more liberal direction, but it moves you into the space where you can tolerate some of that conversation about what is it that we claim to be true as we try to live truly in light of the example that we take Jesus to have offered, right? And that, for me, is where philosophy, I think, has made my Christian life more compelling as a lived practice. And certainly, I would admit, more perceived as dangerous to some power structures within the church. So pastors, not the one I currently have. I attend an amazing Assemblies of God church, and my pastor and I are great friends. But a lot of pastors that I've been in churches under see me as a threat, see me as problematic, see me as dangerous to the faith of their church, because I think we can ask questions and think deeply and come down differently on lots of stuff. And that is not what the crowd wants. That's not what they want. And that's definitely not what the authority structures of a fundamentally too often patriarchal, right, racially discriminatory way of making sense of Christian life, at least especially in the US. And so, when you challenge some of that in the name of the love that you actually see God to model in the person of Christ, that doesn't go as well in some spaces. But I'm fine entering those moments and saying, look, sometimes you have to stand against what Bonhoeffer called, this triumphant church, or the established church. Kierkegaard says we have to sometimes resist that in the name of, what Bonhoeffer calls costly grace. And sometimes what it costs us is our ease and comfort walking with the people who just assume we agree with them. And I think that's actually good, though. I think the church needs more productive tension that animates the existential stakes of what faith is about.
That's a brilliant summary, but I would like to push you a bit further on this topic. How would you suggest someone interact with the relationship between philosophy and faith? How would you want him to be wrestling with these big issues when it's now his turn, maybe in 10 or 15 years, to be reading Kierkegaard, Bonhoeffer, all these great thinkers? How would you, as a father and also as a Christian, want him to approach these ideas?
Yeah, I mean, it is hard because, I started my last comments with saying my mom and I tend to disagree on some stuff. But it's also the case that I'm a parent. And so I fully expect that my son and his experiences, his social context, the norms that become lived for him in ways that for me just aren't, is going to impact the way in which his conception of the divine, and also then the way that his relation to the divine are likely to play out. I would say that because I understand, and this is an important qualification that, again, is cashed out in Camping with Kierkegaard, but faith for me is not a religious thing. Faith is an existential thing that can be made manifest in religious ways. So because I understand faithfulness as risk with direction, all of us, the question is not, will we have faith or not? We're all risking in some direction. It's more the Jean-Paul Sartre question. Will we be in good faith or bad faith, right? Will we take ourselves up in that direction on purpose, or will we find ourselves just with the kind of social inertia continuing to move without actually interrogating and reflecting and standing on purpose, right? And that's important because that existential risk, the nugget by which faith then could play out as, Sartre says, becoming an atheist, or Kierkegaard says, becoming a Christian, or becoming, a Hindu, becoming a Muslim, becoming a Baha'i, all these different ways we could make sense of ourselves and the divine, the transcendent, the good. All of this is in fact nested in a lived plausibility. And that's where the differences between my mom and I, and me and my son, well, what if my son becomes an engineer? He's likely to relate to who God is as revealed in Christ, say, in very different ways, because his framework has to do with the structural integrity of things and how stuff holds together. So he might really like systematic theology in a way that I'm less compelled by, because I'm a deconstructive philosopher of religion, and find the fragmentary, risky dynamics to be actually what stimulates me more joyfully in the world. It could be the case that my son, growing up in a very different social context, where the dynamics of things like racial identity and gender identity and sexuality, et cetera, are going to play out for him in ways that are fundamentally different than when I was, in high school in the 90s. And so those differences, it's not that it changes what is true about God, but it does, I think, change the language by which we make sense of what it would look like to be in relation to God. So language is never static. It's always in a context of meaning, and meaning is always socially framed. So I think this is great that my son and I might end up disagreeing about some stuff. Now, I would not be okay if we disagree about the fundamental dignity of all humans, regardless of, their identity markers. That's not an option for me. It's like, no, that's immoral, man. I'm going to try to raise him to understand that hospitality and that charity shown to all, full stop. That's just what humans should do as the good. But it's entirely plausible to me that he might have a different pneumatology than I do. It's also plausible that he grows up and doesn't use words like pneumatology, right? Which is not a word that most people in my churches understand, and they're all Pentecostals. So all of that seems fine to me. And I think this worry sometimes that we've inherited from like the writers of like the 50s, 60s, and 70s that were so worried about something called humanism and something that would lead to what is often referred to as, the cultural captivity. And this played out in now what we have inherited as these culture wars. My view is like, man, I want to stand against injustice, and I want to stand against sloppy thinking, and I want to stand against cruelty. But like, I don't have to pick up these culture wars as naming the dichotomy of my existence. Like, my parents' generation and people right under them, like, they really think that's the game. And unfortunately in America right now, like, it's defining our political structures. And I'm like, man, like, that's just not my battle. I want to stand for justice and inclusion. I don't want to walk around like carrying signs fighting over something that we realized would play well to a base 20 years ago. And in the same way, I want my son to be freed from whatever baggage I'm bringing to the table. And in doing this, I'd say what I hope for him is that he understands the divine to be maximally nested and maximally revealed as relational love, humbly presented. I would hope that that will remain for him a radical personalism, that God is person and personally related and relationally engaged with him and every other. Beyond that, I'm way less concerned. And it's not because I'm, hey, whatever. It's like, no, I'm not a relativist in that sense. I'm a relativist, of course, that there is nothing that makes sense as true or meaningful except relative to a context. But I don't think, what's true for you, true for me. Hey, it's all the same, baby. Like, let it play. I think that's naive, sloppy thinking. Only if we can take seriously the friction that happens in our disagreement can we take seriously that I might be wrong and need to learn from somebody, right? Humility requires I could be wrong about this. Let's keep talking, which is the hospitality it opens onto. In the book, I have a whole chapter about humility, hospitality, and gratitude as the three core values of what I see as just good ethical theory. I don't draw that from Christianity. I draw that from mountain biking in the book. Now, if I were in a church, I would say these are, I think, the three core values of the Christian tradition, because I don't think it's at odds, right? If Christianity is true, it's not going to be at odds with what is truly human. It's going to be the invitation to be truly human in a way that actually accords with a God of relational love, inviting all of us, come all who are heavy burdened. Not come only those who signed the faith statement that looks exactly like what I said so that you reinforce the power that doesn't challenge my social status. I'm out if that's the game. And again, I think Martin Luther King and James Cone and Dietrich Bonhoeffer are all out too. And so leaning into that cloud of witnesses seems like a pretty good idea. And I look forward to learning from my son places that might be blind spots in my own understanding of these things as he grows up and helps me, interrogate the assumptions that have calcified in my own life.
In this interview, you've raised a lot of different thinkers like Kierkegaard, Levinas, Bonhoeffer, and others. Since you've talked a bit about you getting into philosophy through intellectual history, who are some other thinkers that you might view as extremely important or influential to you? Would it be someone like Hegel? Of course, his relation with philosophy is very profound. But also, are there any other thinkers in Christianity or philosophy which stood out to you?
Yeah, it's changed as I've progressed in my thinking, my career, my life. What compels me at 46 looks different than what compelled me at 24. Not entirely or absolutely so, but in, I think, interesting ways, right? And so what really got me interested in philosophy kind of on the front end, and in some weird way, I don't know if this was because of my historical commitments, but the fact that you're connecting it, maybe it was. It turns out it kind of was Hegel. So I was taking an intellectual history course, a European intellectual history course at Florida State University, working on my master's degree. And the professor, would basically have all the graduate students sign up to do this like big presentation on a different thinker or historical event or whatever. And so we'd all signed up for stuff, and he starts chuckling and he says, "Oh," I said, "in 25 years, nobody's ever picked Hegel, ha ha." And so I went up and changed what I had signed up for. I was like, "I'll do that. I don't even know who that guy is." Okay. Just because I liked the idea of challenge and I liked going into the deep end and seeing what happens, right? And so I remember diving in and thinking, whoa, I had gotten over my head real quick. Like Hegel, if anybody has read him at all, it's kind of like trying to punch your way through tar, because every punch it just gets stuck. Or like in that scene, in Lord of the Rings, where Frodo gets caught in the spider web. It's like that. It's like, well, the more you struggle, the more you get entangled. And so that was kind of my first experience with Hegel. But what it did was opened onto the thinkers that inherited and responded to him. And that's where my sort of, fire started developing, which was, Nietzsche and Kierkegaard and some of the, early existentialist thinkers like Dostoevsky even. So it really was for me the romantics, the German and French and British romantics in that kind of quasi space with absolute idealism and the high modernism of Hegel. That was kind of my first love. But it really was the romantics that drew me in. I loved the passion. I loved the intensity. I loved the embodiment. I loved the way beauty, again, was fragmentary and not some sort of systematic whole that gets all tied up neatly and handed back over. So that's where I really found my stride. And that then opened onto, again, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, etc. And so those thinkers philosophically explain the kind of general trajectory to why I do continental philosophy primarily, though I'm trained in analytic philosophy as well. And I try to write in such a way that analytic philosophers would take what I'm doing seriously and see it as rigorous. But I would say the thinkers that I would say are more influential to my becoming the person who could be influenced by the romantics and the existentialists, those thinkers are perhaps less obvious. So it's, kind of cliche, but it's C.S. Lewis. Like I grew up reading Lewis's stuff. I was raised a white evangelical in America in the 80s and 90s. Like, how could you not read that stuff? But what I loved about it was he seemed not to just be the person I was being told he was in my churches. I'd run into what certainly seems universalist in some of his Chronicles of Narnia texts. And I'd run into, man, like he seems like he's rejecting theodicy in A Grief Observed. The very theodicy he had worked out in The Problem of Pain. Now he's saying, don't come with that. I'm in the midst of suffering. I don't need logic right now, right? And those dynamics, that lived messiness of Lewis, really was compelling to me. So his thought remains very compelling to me when we, again, kind of blur the edges of the clean cut C.S. Lewis handed to us by a lot of white evangelicalism. But yeah, so that's, I guess, my answer. Hegel was the specific linchpin philosophically, but it was romanticism as this cultural movement, mainly literary romanticism, that opened onto philosophical romanticism and then the end of idealism into existentialism. Now, that said, other thinkers that influenced me, Homer, the Iliad, I think, is one of the greatest books of all time about human relationships and the value of affect to who we are as beings. The writings of Aeschylus, Euripides, my goodness, you want to talk about like the dark side of existence and the existential dread that accompanies the fact that maybe we're not as free as we think, or maybe our freedom is so absolute that we can't handle it. Go read the Bacchae. So it was, again, this long humanities training that actually, I think, situated philosophy for me as never just about logic chopping, warranted assertability proof stuff. I love that. And I geek out about that stuff with, my pro friends. But really what made me excited was Emerson and Thoreau and Whitman and, again, Homer, and even the poetry of Veronica Franco. It was that stuff Hölderlin, my goodness, like it just dripped in ways that invited me to think being a human was not disconnected from our materiality. It wasn't something that invited us to turn our backs on non-human others. It actually propelled me into a more robust sort of environmental awareness, a broader ecosystem of what it looks like to care about myself, to engage in neighbor love, etc. But it also invited beauty always to be the flip side of the good, right? Rather than it set off to the side, because what matters is propositional truth. It's like, yeah, but does it compel you? And this, I think, is my Pentecostalism for what it's worth. I was a professional drummer. Like, if it does, I mean, we've heard the old, if it, doesn't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing. Like, for me, that's true. If it doesn't make me nod my head, if it doesn't make me want to dance, if it doesn't make me tap my foot, why am I here at the concert? Right. And that intensity is what I found in some of these thinkers and some of these ideas. And then what they do, and this is what good concerts do, right, is the band actually then becomes part of the dance that's happening. They're inviting you, come on, let's dance together. And for me, that big, important party that is the history of human thinking, like, man, that's so cool when you realize, like, oh, maybe I can dance with these people, right? And so that's kind of where I find myself now at 46, writing Camping with Kierkegaard as an attempt to invite others to hike with me, to talk with me, not because I've got stuff figured out. I answer precious little in this book, but I hope I've invited people to maybe take up why learning to dance as an existential task is something worthwhile,
If you've been enjoying this video so far and would like to enjoy more philosophical content, especially with leading scholars like Aaron, then make sure to like and subscribe. And if you'd like to support our ministry financially, then go check out our Patreon, Christianity for All. We reach around 4,000 new people each month. So if you would like to work towards this ministry, then make sure to support us there financially. So if you would like to support us, make sure you go check our Patreon out. Let's carry on with the video. It's such a coincidence that you raise C.S. Lewis because, of course, we recently had Dr. Simon Horbin, a leading scholar in the English language and literature at the University of Oxford, to talk about C.S. Lewis's life, his ideas, and some of C.S. Lewis's influences. So if you want to check out that video, I'll put a link to that in the card above. But carrying on with this video, since we've talked a lot about how faith and philosophy and life all interact, and it's very difficult to separate these ideas together, I was wondering whether you can now talk a bit more about your book, Camping with Kierkegaard. What are some of the main ideas which are in it? What some of the motivations you had when writing it, and why we should read it as philosophers or people interested in the subject?
Yeah. So I have written, edited lots of books. I think, and I mean, I'm not exactly sure. I think it's like 12 maybe now, books that I've done. And I say that not to brag, but to say the following statement should be understood in that context. This is the first book I've written that makes me excited. All the other books I think were important. I wouldn't have written them if I didn't, but they are narrowly contributing to particular debates that I think really matter, but they matter for professionals, right? Now, there's downstream impacts, but all of my writing up to this point has been geared toward other people who read Danish, other people who take really seriously, the ontological distinctions in Heidegger and how that plays out as inheriting particular early Husserlian ideas and then switches as we move into genetic phenomenology. Most folk who are brilliant and world-changing people, that's not the language game in which they play. And something occurred to me when the pandemic hit. It was, man, like, I'm so glad there are epidemiologists and immunologists and, chemical scientists and all these people doing work in labs, talking to each other in ways I cannot follow. I can't understand. I couldn't read one of their papers and make sense of it. I need them to be that good and that technical, because that's what yields a vaccine that maybe will protect my mom and protect my son and protect my people I love, right? But then when it came time for, hey, these pros did a thing. Now it's handed to us. Where did things go weird? It went weird with people then trying to explain what this looks like, why it's important, what effectiveness means, how it gets deployed. And again, I'm not saying this in any sort of specific to vaccine ways, but as an illustration that unless we can find ways to take what the technical expertise of scholars is about and position it as invitationally accessible to a broader audience, it's not that what we did wasn't important. Again, the most important thing is getting a vaccine that works, right? Like, do your lab work, do your homework. Like, yes. And don't worry about making that accessible to some silly philosopher. Make it work to your peers so that then what is offered to me is something that actually has substance and weight, right? The same is true, I think, in philosophy. And far too often, philosophy gets distributed to the masses as just self-help or motivational thinking. And it's always pithily deployed in ways that, to be honest, are trivial and patronizing to the dignity of humans as thinkers. Not professional philosophers, but the fact that part of our dignity, part of what makes us matter, is that we are not simply cogs and machines. We are not simply employees. We are spaces and instances of wrestling with existential questions. And we don't have to do that in technical philosophical ways for it to be the most important thing that we do with most of our lives. And so this book, why it excites me, why I'm stoked about it, why I want to get it in the hands of everybody, is it is that kind of book. It's the book that says, look, I've written dozens, hundreds of articles, and most of those are about Kierkegaard or phenomenology or existentialism or philosophy of religion, or like all these ideas I've written so much about. Nearly none of it would I hand to somebody who's in a midlife crisis and say, you know what, I don't have answers for you, but maybe this will help you rethink what matters and why you've got enough to get through this. Maybe the graduate coming out of college who is, what am I going to do with my life? What's my calling? How do I move forward? How do I make a difference in the world? I can't tell them the answer to those questions, but maybe if they understood some of the ideas of faithfulness in Kierkegaard and understood what it looks like to take seriously Camus describing Sisyphus as happy even when burdened with the misery of an eternal rock, maybe that allows them to kind of gain a little bit of fortitude to navigate some of those complicated spaces they're going to have to live into. That's the point of this book. So this book is anchored in the question, what is worthy of your finitude? And by that question, I mean the human condition is defined by two things. We are relational. None of us is an island. This is why I am a staunch opponent of egoistic libertarianism, radically opposed to a thick individualism, because what it does is actually it erases the relationality that defines the human condition, my human existence, as a response and responsibility in relation to other people. And in this case, not just other people, but also other non-human others, right? The ecosystem, the social structures. We're responsible for this stuff. And so let's actually get good at it. But our relationality is conditioned essentially by our mortality, by the fact that we are, in fact, vulnerable. So we are relational and we are vulnerable. And that vulnerability means we've got to be good at these relationships because we don't have an infinite time to do it. What will matter in my life because I don't have an infinite amount of time to figure out what to do with my time? That's finitude. That's what that means. And so for the existentialists, that idea is what conditions freedom. It conditions action. It conditions love. It conditions the way we relate to death as offering the context of meaning making. And so this book draws on existential philosophy, not just existentialism. I'm drawing on, people like Shakespeare and and Lamont and a bunch of hip hop artists, right? Like, so it's a wide kind of background of folks who I think are all existential in the awareness of relationality and vulnerability. And then I apply those ideas with a whole bunch of personal stories and my experiences in the mountains, mountain biking, trout fishing, camping, hiking, backpacking. How do these things intersect such that the question, what is worthy of my finitude, is not one that I can answer for you, but maybe I can motivate it as a question you take up every single day. You live that question. And that's where then I recommend my thesis is, if we ask that question seriously and learn from the existential thinkers that I draw upon, again, from the Wu-Tang Clan to extreme heavy metal, all the way to liberation theology and existentialism, they all help us realize, if we understand our life on a success-oriented model of value, we check boxes. Get that degree from Oxford, check. Now I matter. Well, the problem is you still have to live, right? So how are you going to live? Oh, get that job at Yale, check. Well, but you've got to actually show up and now teach. Like, go get married, check. Well, I'm less impressed that you got married. I'm more impressed that you were able to stay in that relationship for decades, right? Be a great father. I had a fathering win last week. I mean, like, I was the best dad in the world, like on Tuesday. But I didn't leave my family on Wednesday, right? I should have. I walked out on a high note. I'm done. Win. Well, of course not. I have to stay invested. And then Wednesday sucked. But how can I navigate that up and down? We move away from success defining our value and anchoring our subjectivity, and we move to what I call faithfulness. And faithfulness is not go be a Christian, go be a Buddhist. Faithfulness is you risk yourself with direction. So what direction is worth your finitude? What is worthy of your finitude? And so that's the book. It is accessible. It is written for everybody. But, and this is, I think, an important qualification, I'm still a pro-philosopher. So I don't think the book is patronizing. I don't think it's trivial. I don't think it's reducible to some sort of claptrap sort of, model of motivational thinking. It is still doing what I take to be serious philosophical work, just in a mode and with examples that hopefully invite everybody to figure out what brings them joy. How do they live into it? How do they navigate the difficulties of life? And that's not a magic bullet that we are done with, right? It's not a keto diet to now be healthy or something. It's the idea that you are who you're becoming. So let's be better at investing ourselves in that lifetime task of faithfully becoming who we hope to have been. And doesn't mean you like camping, doesn't mean you like mountain biking. What is it you love? How do you live into it? Find that for yourself. So the camping part is my story, right? But it's also this metaphor for we go to the woods to live intentionally, to live deliberately, said Thoreau. And so going camping with Kierkegaard, the idea is get away from the crowd, get away from the noise and bustle of everyday life, the assumptions of your church that just dictate what we think. Go into the woods with Kierkegaard, right? Find what solitude would look like, not like radically by myself, but able to let myself be purposive as a task. Well, let's go camping with Kierkegaard in order to figure that out. Even if camping with Kierkegaard means, like it does for my wife, going to the beach with romantic, novellas. Right? That's her camping with Kierkegaard. And I think that rocks. For somebody else, it might be drinking really good tea with friends, but doing it more regularly so that they get that energy to continue to say, you know what, today I got to go to the office. I'm going to freaking do this. You know what? I'm working 5 jobs and this sucks. I don't have time to think. What a luxury that is. I get it. And yet, even in that space, we are never unfree relative to faithfulness. And that's why the upshot of the book is that we live more intentionally for ourselves, but also, and this is important, that we remember that relationality side and now start being committed to a vision of justice that would make sure none of our neighbors find themselves unable to go camping with Kierkegaard. Have we made that task impossible because of systemic racism or systemic poverty or all kinds of power structures that actually eliminate the agency and dignity of human life? And if we have, we need to fix that stuff. So this book is, in some sense, an ideal calling that then says, I'm not telling you how to get there, but I'm trying to invite you to be committed to this because I think it's worthwhile. And I want people to take a look at it. I really want them to enjoy it. I hope they love it. If they do read it and enjoy Camping with Kierkegaard, Faithfulness in the Way of Life, please drop a review, hopefully 5-star on Amazon, because the only way this kind of book makes the sort of impact that I hope it makes is if people really do spread the word about it. This is a kind of DIY punk band sort of book. And I need folks to help me get the word out, to get copies in the hands of people who need this stuff. And don't worry, if they aren't a philosopher, this book is still for them. Don't worry, if they have never been to an REI or they can't imagine why anybody would sleep on the ground, this book is still for them. So Camping with Kierkegaard, it's an invitation to live on purpose. And I really, really, really hope that it helps people find encouragement in the human condition.
Now, on this channel, we do talk a lot about philosophy and academia. In fact, my new college son, who's going to be my mentee at Oxford, actually reached out to me a few days ago and said, "Hey, Josh, it's such a coincidence. I used to be watching Philosophy for All in the time leading up to me applying to Oxford, and that's been really helpful." And that is something that I want to do on this channel, is really to spread the love of philosophy and academia to the world. And as a result, with that focus of academia in mind, I was wondering what ideas got you into philosophy and what were some of the reasons that you decided to choose to become a professor?
Yeah, well, this is not going to be helpful, but it's true. And I talk about this in the book. I chose a career in academia because my dad is an academic and he fishes like 80 to 100 days a year. I was like, my gosh, like there's a job that lets you trout fish every second or third day. And so that's literally what drew me into academia as a profession. Now, again, I loved the questions. I was also, vibing on this stuff in grad school, but it was more, again, this affect thing. It was, what did I want my life to involve? And I wanted it to involve being able to go fishing. And I knew that lots of careers made that really hard, and, looked at academics and thought, man, this is fantastic. Now, what I didn't understand, and I would say as a kind of caution to people who want to be an academic for such silly reasons, it takes a long time to get to the point where that flexibility is palpable in a way that you feel like you can actually live into it. And so I would say, I didn't understand tenure. I didn't understand, how much you have to publish to kind of get that traction in order to then take days off and go fishing. But that's actually what drew me into it.
That's a wonderful reason. Honestly, if I could go fishing all those days, I would definitely become a professor as well. However, I'm not sure how things would go and how things will work out in the future. But for the last question of this interview, what would you say are some of the pros and cons of academia, and how do they balance out?
I think that one of the cool things about being a professor is precisely the fact that we get to do philosophy with people who want to do philosophy or history or sociology, right? And that's so cool to have 18-ish year olds stoked about thinking deeply about stuff that for most of their life they've not had access to. And that's pretty awesome, man. Like last night, I taught a 3-hour course on a class called God, Death, and the Meaning of Life. And we got there and I was like, guys, I am super hungry. I just finished teaching 4 courses back to back. I'm exhausted. I'm tired. I'm hungry. I need a protein bar. How many of y'all need dinner? Because the class is in the evening. Half the room's hands went up. And I was like, you know what? The most important thing we can do in this class, the best philosophy I can show you, is let's all walk over to the student union and grab some dinner. So we walked over to the student union, 30 students trailing behind me. We all get protein bars. We went out on the lawn, sat there and ate and chatted. And then we took a walk for 2.5 hours around campus, talking about existentialism, Heidegger's notions of being towards death, why life matters. And we ended at this sort of big space on campus that is part of the lore of campus, which is, hey, if you kiss under the bell tower, you'll end up getting married, kind of a thing. And I said, what if we, instead of that silly legend, made it more Every time you see the bell tower from anywhere on campus, you are reminded of your relational vulnerability. You are invested in your finitude. Why don't we flip what things mean in order to live more effectively? And so we're now moving into Nietzsche and thinking about these ideas. And so we're going to go hiking and talk about Nietzsche. We're going to we talked about Kierkegaard. We're actually going to have a big campfire and sit around the campfire and think together about these ideas. So why be a professor? Because you get to invite people to get invested in that dance, right? You've got the mosh pit running up at the front, but there's a whole group of people up in the, balcony. And it's like when the singer says, y'all come on down, move the chairs. So the thing I love about being a professor is inviting people to come in the mosh pit up at the front. Whatever your background, hopefully we can break down the stigmas of, well, college is only for the wealthy. Let's fix that as a social issue. It's only for these types of people. Let's make it accessible to all, right? Let's find ways to actually make that pit, that dance party, something that everybody who wants to can come play in. And then what it is to be a professor is to make sure that, nobody gets trampled in the midst of the mosh pit, but that everybody walks out saying that was an amazing freaking time. And if you can do that for 4 years in college and then go into life in a way where you're motivated by faithfulness, not success, where you're invested in thinking well, whatever your career, you're never deceived by the idea that your employment status dictates your value. Man, we did a great job then if that's what we helped people think about. And I think it's the best career in the world, not more important than other things, but I chose it and I would choose it 1,000 times over. And I encourage anybody else who's thinking about it. It's hard. Risk is involved. It's a rough way. It's a hard on-ramp, but it is the case that it matters. And so if it's something that you love, it's something you want to do, I would absolutely say, hey, we need you to come in and be good at this because we need others to change the song and make the dance more interesting.
I hope you've enjoyed this interview with Dr. Aaron Simmons. If you'd like to support his works and check out his most recent book, then go check out Camping with Kierkegaard. A link to that will be in the description below. Likewise, as I've said, if you would like to support this channel financially, go check out our Patreon at Christianity for All to support our mission, and also make sure to like and subscribe and share this video with your friends. Hope to see you soon. Thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you next one. Have a great day, and God bless.